Okay, alright. Welcome back to Paper Cuts, everybody. Last time we got started on The Secret Garden, and it's time to continue with that. So let's do that, shall we? With Chapter 8, The Robin Who Showed the Way. She looked at the key quite a long time. She turned it over and over and thought about it. As I've said before, she was not a child who had been trained to ask permission or consult her elders about things. All she thought about the key was that if it was the key to the closed garden, and she could find out where the door was, she could perhaps open it and see what was inside the walls. And what had happened to the old rose trees? It was because it had been shut up so long that she wanted to see it. It seemed as if it must be different from other places, and that something strange must have happened to it during 10 years. Besides that, if she liked it, she could go into it every day and shut the door behind her. She could make up some play of her own and play it quite alone, because no one would ever know where she was, but would think the door was still locked and the key buried in the earth. The thought of that pleased her very much. Living, as it were, all by herself in a house with 100 mysteriously closed rooms, and having nothing whatsoever to do to amuse herself, had set her inactive brain to working, and was actually awakening her imagination. There's no doubt that the fresh, strong, pure air from the moor had a great deal to do with that, too. Just as it had given her an appetite, and fighting with the wind had stirred her blood, so the same things had stirred her mind. In India she had always been too hot and languid and weak to care about much of anything. But in this place she was beginning to care and to want to do things. Already she felt less contrary, although she didn't know why. She put the key in her pocket and walked up and down her walk. No one but herself ever seemed to come there, so she could walk slowly and look at the wall, or rather the ivy growing on it. The ivy was a baffling thing. Howsoever carefully she looked, she could see nothing but thickly growing, glossy, dark green leaves. She was very much disappointed. Something of her contrariness came back to her as she paced the walk and looked over at it, the tree-tops inside. It seemed so silly, she said to herself, to be near it and not able to get in. She took the key in her pocket when she went back to the house, and she made up her mind that she'd always carry it with her when she went out, so that if she ever should find the hidden door, she would be ready. Miss Medlock had allowed Martha to sleep all night at the cottage, but she was back at her work in the morning with cheeks redder than ever and in her best of spirits. "I got up at 4 o'clock, and it was pretty on the moor with the birds riding up and the rabbits scampering about and the sun rising. I didn't walk all the way. Man gave me a ride in his cart, and I did enjoy myself." She was full of stories and of delight about her day out. Her mother had been glad to see her, and they got the baking and the washing all out of the way. She'd even made each of the children a dough cake with a bit of brown sugar in it. I had 'em all piping hot when they came in from playing on the moor, and the cottage smelt all nice, clean hot bacon, and there was a good fire, and they just shouted for joy. Our Dickens said the cottage was good enough for a king. And in the evening they'd all sat round the fire, and Martha and her mother had sewed patches on torn clothes and mended stockings, and Martha had told them about the little girl who had come from India, and who had been waited on all her life by what Martha called, well, natives, until she didn't know how to put on her own stockings. "Oh, they did like to hear about you. They wanted to know about all them natives and the ship you come in. I couldn't tell 'em enough." And Mary reflected a bit. "I'll tell you a great deal more before your next day out, so that they will have more to talk about. I dare say they'd like to hear about riding on elephants and camels, and about the officers going to hunt tigers. My word, it set 'em clean off their heads. Would you really do that, miss? Be the same as a wild beast show like we heard they had in York once." "India's quite different from Yorkshire," Mary said slowly as she thought the matter over. "I never thought of that. Did Dickon and your mother like to hear you talk about me?" "Why, Dickon's eyes nearly start out of his head, they got that round. But Mother, she was all put out about your seeming to be all yourself like. She said, 'Hasn't Miss Craven got no governess for her, nor nurse?' And I said, 'No, he hasn't, though Miss Medlock says he will when he thinks of it, but she says he mayn't think of it for 2 or 3 years. I don't want a governess. But Mother says you ought to be learning your book by this time, and you ought to have a woman to look after you. And she says, now, Martha, you just think about how you'd feel yourself in a big place like that, wandering about all alone. No, Mother, you do your best to cheer her up, she says, and I said I would. Mary gave her a long, steady look. You do cheer me up. I like to hear you talk. And Martha went out of the room and came back with something held in her hands under her apron. What do you think? I brought you a present, she said with a cheerful grin. A present! Exclaimed Mistress Mary. How could a cottage full of 14 hungry people give anyone a present? Man was driving across the moor peddling, and he stopped his cart at our door. He had pots and pans and odds and ends, but Mother had no money to buy anything. Just as he was going away, our Elizabeth Ellen called out, Mother, he's got a skipping rope with red and blue handles. And Mother, she calls out quite suddenly, Here, stop, mister, how much are they? And he says, 2 pence. And Mother, she began fumbling in her pocket, and she says to me, Martha, there's brought me the wages like a good lass, and I got 4 places to put every penny, but I'm just going to take 2 pence out of it to buy that child a skipping rope. And she bought one, and here it is. She brought it out from under her apron and exhibited it quite proudly. It was a strong, slender rope with a striped red and blue handle at each end, but Mary Lennox had never seen a skipping rope before. She gazed at it with a mystified expression. What's it for? For? Does that mean they got no skipping ropes in India? For all they got the elephants, the tigers, and the camels? No wonder most of 'em's this way. This is what it's for. Just watch me. And she ran into the middle of the room, and taking a handle in each hand, began to skip and skip and skip, while Mary turned in her chair to stare at her, and the strange faces in the old portraits seemed to stare at her too, and wonder what on earth this common little cottager had the impudence to be doing under their very notices. But Martha didn't even see them. The interest and curiosity in Mistress Mary's face delighted her, and she went on skipping, and counted as she skipped until she had reached 100. I could skip longer than that, she said when she stopped. I skipped as much as 500 when I was 12, but I wasn't as fast as I am now, and I was in practice. Mary got up from her chair, beginning to feel a little excited herself. It looks nice. Your mother's a kind woman. Do you think I could ever skip like that? You just try it, urged Martha, handing her the skipping rope. You can't skip 100 at first, but if you practice, you'll mount up. That's what Mother said. She says nothing will do her more good than skipping rope. It's a senseless toy a child can have. Let her play out in the fresh air skipping, and it'll stretch her legs and arms and give her some strength in them. It was plain that there wasn't a great deal of strength in Mistress Mary's arms and legs when she first began to skip. She wasn't very clever at it, but she liked it so much that she didn't want to stop. Put on your things and run and skip out of doors. Mother said I must tell you to keep out of doors as much as you could, even when it rains a bit, so that you wrap up warm. And Mary put on her coat and hat. And took her skipping rope over her arm. She opened the door to go out, and then suddenly thought of something, and then turned back rather slowly. Martha, they were your wages. It was your 2 pence, really. Thank you. She said it stiffly, because she wasn't used to thanking people, or noticing that they did things for her. Thank you, she said, and held out her hand, because she didn't know what else to do. Martha gave her hand a clumsy little shake, as if she wasn't accustomed to this sort of thing either, and then she laughed. You're a queer, old womanish thing. If this had been our Elizabeth Ellen, she'd give me a kiss. And Mary looked stiffer than ever. Do you want me to kiss you? And Martha laughed again. No, not me. If he is different, perhaps you'd want to yourself, but you're not. So run off outside and play with your rope. And Mistress Mary felt a little awkward as she went out of the room. Yorkshire people seemed strange, and Martha was always rather a puzzle to her. At first she disliked her very much, but now she didn't. The skipping rope was a wonderful thing. She counted and skipped and skipped and counted, until her cheeks were quite red, and she was more interested than she had ever been since she was born. The sun was shining, and a little wind was blowing. Not a rough wind, but one which came in delightful little gusts, and brought a fresh scent of newly turned earth with it. She skipped around the fountain garden, and up one walk and down one another. She skipped at last into the kitchen garden, and saw Ben Weatherstaff digging and talking to his robin, which was hopping about him. She skipped down the walk toward him, and he lifted his head and looked at her with a strange expression. She had wondered if he'd notice her. She wanted him to see her skip. "Well, upon my word, perhaps they are young, and after all, perhaps it's got child blood in your veins instead of sour buttermilk. You skipped red in your cheeks, sure as my name's Ben Weatherstaff. Wouldn't have believed you could do it."
"I never skipped before. I'm just beginning. I can only go up to 20.
Keep on. Your shape's well enough at it for a young'un. You live with the heathen. Just see how he's watching you." And he jerked his head toward the robin. "He followed after you yesterday. He'll be at it again today. He's bound to find out what a skipping rope is. He's never seen one, huh?" And he shook his head at the bird. "And your curiosity be the death of you sometime if you don't look sharp." Mary skipped round all the gardens and round the orchard, resting every few minutes. At length she went to her own special walk, and made up her mind to try to see if she could skip the whole length of it. It was a good long skip, and she began slowly, but before she had gone halfway down the path she was so hot and breathless that she was obliged to stop. She didn't mind much, because she had already counted up to 30. She stopped with a little laugh of pleasure, and there, lo and behold, was the robin swaying on a long branch of ivy. He'd followed her, and he greeted her with a chirp. As Mary skipped toward him, she felt something heavy in her pocket strike against her at each jump, and when she saw the robin she laughed again.
You showed me where the key was yesterday. You ought to show me the door today, but I don't believe you know."
And the robin flew from his swinging spray of ivy onto the top of the wall, and he opened his beak and sang a long, lovely trill, merely to show off. Nothing in the world is quite as adorably lovely as a robin when he shows off, and they nearly are always doing it. Mary Lennox had heard a great deal about magic in Rhea's stories, and she always said that what happened almost at that moment was magic. One of the nice little gusts of wind rushed down the walk, and it was a stronger one than the rest. It was strong enough to wave the branches of the trees, and it was more than strong enough to sway the trailing sprays of untrimmed ivy hanging from the wall. Mary had stepped quite close to the robin, and suddenly the gust of wind swung aside some loose ivy trails, and more suddenly still she jumped toward it and caught it in her hand. This she did because she had seen something under it, a round knob which had been covered by the leaves hanging over it. It was the knob of a door. She put her hands under the leaves and began to pull and push them aside. Thick as the ivy hung, it was nearly all a loose and swinging curtain, though some had crept over the wood and the iron. Mary's heart began to thump, and her hands began to shake a little, in her delight and excitement. The robin kept singing and twittering away and tilting his head on one side, as if he were as excited as she was. What was this under her hands, which was square and made of iron, and which her fingers found a hole in? It was the lock of a door, which had been closed 10 years, and she put her hand in her pocket, drew out the key, and found the keyhole. She put the key in and turned it. It took her 2 hands to do it, but it did turn. Then she took a long breath and looked behind her up the long walk to see if anyone was coming. No one was coming. No one ever did come, it seemed. And she took another long breath because she couldn't help it, and she held back the swinging curtain of ivy and pushed back the door, which opened slowly, slowly. Then she slipped through it, and it shut behind her, and stood with her back against it, looking about her and breathing quite fast with excitement and wonder and delight. She was standing inside the secret garden. Chapter 9. The strangest house anyone ever lived in. It was the sweetest, most mysterious-looking place anyone could imagine. The high walls which shut it in were covered with the leafless stems of climbing roses, which were so thick they were matted together. Mary Lennox knew that they were roses because she'd seen a great many roses in India. All the ground was covered with grass of a wintry brown, and out of it grew clumps of bushes, which were surely rose bushes if they were alive. There were numbers of standard roses which had so spread their branches that they were like little trees. There were other trees in the garden, and one of the things which made the place look strangest and loveliest was that climbing roses had run all over them, and swung down long tendrils which made light swaying curtains, and here and there they'd caught at each other, or a far-reaching branch, and crept from one tree to another, and made lovely bridges of themselves. There were neither leaves nor roses on them now, and Mary didn't know whether they were dead or alive, but their thin gray or brown branches and sprays looked like a sort of hazy mantle spreading over everything, walls, trees, and even the brown grass, where they'd fallen from their fastenings and run along the ground. It was this hazy tangle from tree to tree which made it all look so mysterious. Mary had thought it must be different from other gardens which had not been left all by themselves for so long, and indeed it was different from any other place she'd ever seen in her life.
How still it is! How still!
And then she waited a moment and listened at the stillness. The robin, who had flown to his tree-top, was still as all the rest. He didn't even flutter his wings. He sat without stirring, and he looked at Mary.
No wonder it's still. I'm the first person who's spoken in here for 10 years.
And she moved away from the door, stepping as softly as if she were afraid of awakening someone. She was glad that there was grass under her feet, and that her steps made no sounds. She walked under one of the fairy-like gray arches, between the trees, and looked up at the sprays and tendrils which all formed them.
I wonder if they're all quite dead. Is it all a quite dead garden? I wish it wasn't.
If she had been Ben Weatherstaff, she could have told whether the wood was alive by only looking at it, but she could only see that there was gray or brown sprays and branches, and none showed any signs of even a tiny leaf bud anywhere. But she was inside the wonderful garden, and she could come through the door under the ivy any time, and she felt as if she had found a world all her own. The sun was shining inside the four walls, and the high arc of blue sky over this particular piece of Misselthwaite seemed even more brilliant and soft than it was over the moor. The robin flew down from his tree-top and hopped about, or flew after her from one branch to another. He chirped a good deal, and had a very busy air, as if he were showing her things. Everything was strange and silent, and she seemed to be hundreds of miles away from anyone, but somehow she didn't feel lonely at all. All that troubled her was her wish that she knew whether all the roses were dead, or if perhaps some of them had lived and might put out leaves and buds as the weather got warmer. She didn't want it to be quite a dead garden. If it were a quite alive garden, how wonderful it would be, and what thousands of roses would grow on every side. Her skipping rope had hung over her arm when she came in, and after she'd walked about for a little while, she thought she would skip around the whole garden, stopping when she wanted to look at things. There seemed to have been grass paths here and there, and in one or two corners there were alcoves of evergreen with stone seats, or tall, moss-covered flower urns in them. As she came near the second of these alcoves, she stopped skipping. There had once been a flower bed in here, and she thought she saw something sticking out of the black earth, some sharp little pale green points. She remembered what Ben Weatherstaff had said, and she knelt down to look at them.
Yes, there are tinier growing things, and they might be crocuses or snowdrops or daffodils.
She bent very close to them and sniffed the fresh scent of the damp earth, and she liked it very much.
Perhaps there are some other ones growing up in other places. I'll go all over the garden and look.
She didn't skip now, but she walked. She went slowly and kept her eyes on the ground. She looked in the old border beds and among the grass, and after she'd gone round trying to miss nothing, she had found ever so many more sharp, pale green points, and she'd become quite excited again.
It isn't a quite dead garden, she cried out softly to herself. Even if the roses are dead, there's other things alive.
She didn't know anything about gardening, but the grass seemed so thick in some of the places where the green points were pushing their way through that she thought they didn't have room enough to grow. She searched about until she found a rather sharp piece of wood, and knelt down and dug and weeded out the weeds and grass till she made nice little clear places around them.
Now they look as if they could breathe, she said after finishing with the first ones. I'm going to do ever so many more. I'll do all I can see. If I haven't time today, I can come tomorrow.
And she went from place to place and dug and weeded and enjoyed herself so immensely that she was led on from bed to bed and into the grass under the trees. The exercise had made her so warm that she first threw her coat off, then her hat, and without knowing it she was smiling down onto the grass and the pale green points all the time. The robin was tremendously busy. He was very much pleased to see gardening begun on his own estate. He had often wondered at Ben Weatherstaff. Where gardening is done, all sorts of delightful things to eat are turned up with the soil, And now here was this new kind of creature who was not half Ben's size, and yet had the sense to come into his garden and begin at once. Mistress Mary worked into her garden until it was time to go to her midday dinner. In fact, she was rather late in remembering, and when she put on her coat and hat and picked up her skipping rope, she could not believe that she had been working 2 or 3 hours. She had been actually happy all the time, and there were dozens and dozens of the tiny pale green points that were in cleared places now, looking twice as cheerful as they had looked before when the grass and weeds had been smothering them. "I'll come back this afternoon," she said, looking all round at her new kingdom, and speaking to the trees and the rose bushes as if they heard her. Then she ran lightly across the grass, pushed open the slow old door, and slipped through it under the ivy. She had such red cheeks and such bright eyes, and ate such a dinner that Martha was delighted. "2 pieces of meat and 2 helps of rice pudding. Mother'll be pleased when I tell you what the skipping rope's done for you." In the course of her digging with her pointed stick, Mistress Mary had found herself digging up a sort of white root, rather like an onion. She'd put it back in its place and patted the earth carefully down on it, and just now she wondered if Martha could tell her what it was. "Martha, what are those white roots that look like onions?" "They're bulbs. Lots of spring flowers grow from them. The very little ones are snowdrops and crocuses, and the big ones are narcissuses and jonquils and daffodillies. The biggest of all of them is lilies and purple flags. They're nice. Dickon's got a whole lot of them planted in our bit of a garden." Does Dickon know all about them?" asked Mary, a new idea taking possession of her. "Our Dickon can make a flower grow out of a brick walk. Mother says he just whispers things out of the ground." "Do bulbs live a long time? Will they live years and years if no one helped them?" "Yeah, their things just help themselves. It's why poor folks can afford to have 'em. If you don't trouble 'em, most will work away underground for a lifetime and spread out and have little ones. There's a place in the park woods here where there's snowdrops by the thousands. The prettiest sight in Yorkshire when the spring comes. No one knows when they first got planted." "I wish the spring was here now. I want to see all the things that grow in England." And she'd finished her dinner and gone to her favorite seat on the hearthrug. I wish I had a little spade." "And whatever do you want a little spade for? Are you going to take to digging? I must tell Mother that, too." And Mary looked at the fire and pondered a little. She must be careful if she meant to keep her secret kingdom. She wasn't doing any harm, but if Mr. Craven found out about the open door, he'd be fearfully angry and get a new key and lock it up forevermore. She really couldn't bear that. "This is such a big, lonely place," she said slowly, as if she were turning matters over in her mind. "The house is lonely, and the park is lonely, and the gardens are lonely. So many places seem shut up. I never did many things in India, but there were more people to look at, natives and soldiers marching by. Sometimes bands played, and my ayah told me stories. There's no one here to talk to except you and Ben Weatherstaff. You have your work, and Ben Weatherstaff won't speak to me often. I thought if I had a little spade I could dig somewhere, as he does, and I might make a little garden if he could give me some seeds." And Martha's face lit up. "There now, if that wasn't one of the things Mother said. She says there's such a lot of rooms in that big place. Why don't they give her a bit for herself, even if she doesn't plant nothing but parsley and radishes? She'd dig and rake away and be right on happy over it. That was the very word she said." "Were they? How many things she knows, doesn't she?" "It's like she says, a woman as brings up 12 children learns something besides their ABC. Children's as good as arithmetic, just actually find out things."
"How much would a spade cost, a little one?"
"Well, at Sweet Village there's a shop or so, and I saw a little garden set with a spade and a rake and a fork all tied together for 2 shillings. They were stout enough to work with, too."
"I got more than that in my purse. Miss Morrison gave me 5 shillings, and Miss Medlock gave me some money for Mr. Craven."
"Did you remember that much?"
"Miss Medlock says I was to have a shilling a week to spend. She gives me one every Saturday. I don't know what to spend it on."
"My word, that's riches. You can buy anything in the world she wants. The rent of our cottage is only 3 pence, and it's like pulling eye teeth to get it. Now, I just thought of something."
"What's that?"
"In the shop at Sweet they sell packages of flower seeds for a penny each. Our Dickon, he knows which the greatest, prettiest ones, and how to make 'em grow. Walks over to Thwaite many a day just for the fun of it. Do you know how to print letters?"
"I know how to write."
And Martha shook her head.
Our Dickon can only read printing. If he could print, we could write a letter to him and ask him to go and buy the garden tools and the seeds at the same time."
"Oh, you're a lovely girl, you are really. I didn't know you were so nice. I know I can print letters if I try. Let's ask Miss Medlock for a pen and ink and some paper."
"I got some of my own. I brought it so I could print a bit of a letter to Mother this Sunday. I'll go and get it." And she ran out of the room, and Mary stood by the fire and twisted her thin little hands together with sheer pleasure.
"If I have a spade, I can make the earth nice and soft and dig up weeds. If I have seeds and can make flowers grow, the garden won't be dead at all. It'll come alive."
She didn't go out again that afternoon, because when Martha returned with her pen and ink and paper, she was obliged to clear the table and carry the plates and dishes downstairs. When she got into the kitchen, Miss Medlock was there and told her to do something, so Mary waited for what seemed to her a long time before she came back. And it was a serious piece of work to write to Dickon. Mary had been taught very little because her governesses had disliked her too much to stay with her. She couldn't spell particularly well, but she found she could print letters when she tried, and this was the letter Martha dictated to her. "My dear Dickon, this comes hoping to find you well, as it leaves me at present. Miss Mary has plenty of money and will set you to go to Thwaite and buy her some flower seeds and a garden and some garden tools to make a flower bed. Pick the prettiest ones and the easiest ones to grow, because she's never done it before and lived in India, which is different. Give my love to Mother and every one of you. Miss Mary is going to tell me a lot more, so that on my next day out you can hear about elephants and camels and gentlemen hunting lions and tigers. Your loving sister, Martha Phoebe Sowerby."
"We'll put the money in the envelope, and I'll get the butcher boy to take it in his cart. He's a great friend of Dickon's."
"How shall I get the things when Dickon buys them?"
"He'll bring 'em over to you himself. He'll like to walk over this way."
"Oh, and then I'll see him. I never thought I should see Dickon."
"Do you want to see him?"
And Martha said this suddenly, for Mary had looked so pleased.
"Yes, I do. I never saw a boy foxes and crows loved. I want to see him very much."
And Martha gave a little start as if she remembered something.
"Now to think of me forgetting something that there. I was going to tell you the first thing this morning. I asked Mother, and she said she'd ask Miss Medlock her own self."
"Do you mean—"
"What I said Tuesday. Ask her if you might be driven over to her cottage some day and have a bit of Mother's hot cake and butter and a glass of milk."
And it seemed as if all the interesting things were happening in one day. To think of going over the moor in the daylight when the sky was blue, to think of going into the cottage which held 12 children.
"Does she think Miss Medlock would let me go?"
"Yeah, I think she would. She knows what a tidy woman Mother is, how clean she keeps her cottage."
"If I went, I should see your mother as well as Dickon,"
said Mary, thinking it over and liking the idea very much.
"She doesn't seem to like the mothers in India."
And her work in the garden and the excitement of the afternoon ended by making her feel quiet and thoughtful. Martha stayed with her until tea time, but they sat in comfortable quiet and talked very little. But just before Martha went downstairs for the tea tray, Mary asked a question.
"Martha, has the scullery maid had the toothache again today?"
"What makes you ask that?"
"Because I waited so long for you to come back. I opened the door and walked down the corridor to see if you're coming. And I heard that far off crying again, just like we heard it the other night. There isn't a wind today, so you see it couldn't have been the wind."
"Oh, you mustn't go around walking in the corridors and listening. Mr. Craven will be that there ain't. There's no water what he do."
"I wasn't listening. I was just waiting for you. And I heard it. That's 3 times.
"Oh, my word, that's Miss Medlock's bell,"
said Martha, and she almost ran out of the room.
"It's the strangest house everyone has ever lived in,"
said Mary drowsily as she dropped her head on the cushioned seat of the armchair near her. Fresh air and digging and skipping rope had made her feel so comfortably tired that she fell asleep. Chapter 10. Dickon. The sun shone down for nearly a week on the secret garden. The secret garden was what Mary had called it when she was thinking of it. She liked the name, and she still liked more the feeling that it was when its beautiful old walls shut her in that no one knew where she was. It seemed almost like being shut out of the world in some fairy place. The few books she had read and liked had been fairy story books, and she'd read of secret gardens in some of the stories. Sometimes people went to sleep in them for 100 years,
which she thought must be rather stupid. She had no intention of going to sleep, and in fact she was becoming wider awake every day which passed at Misselthwaite. She was beginning to like to be out of doors. She no longer hated the wind, but enjoyed it. She could run faster and longer, and she could skip up to 100. The bulbs in the secret garden must have been astonished. Such nice clear places were made round them that they had all the breathing space they wanted, and really, if Mistress Mary had known it, they had begun to cheer up under the dark earth and work tremendously. The sun could get at them and warm them, and when the rain came down it could reach them at once, so they began to feel very much alive. Mary was an odd, determined little person, and now she had something interesting to be determined about. She was very much absorbed indeed. She worked and dug and pulled up weeds steadily, only becoming more pleased with her work every hour instead of tiring of it. It seemed to her like a fascinating sort of play. She found many more of the sprouting pale green points than she ever hoped to find. They seemed to be starting up everywhere, and each day she was sure she found tiny new ones, some so tiny that they barely peeped above the earth. There were so many that she remembered what Martha had said about the snowdrops by the thousands, and about bulbs spreading and making new ones. These had been left to themselves for 10 years, and perhaps they had spread, like the snowdrops, into the thousands. She wondered how long it would be before they showed that they were flowers. Sometimes she stopped digging to look at the garden and try to imagine what it would be like when it was covered with thousands of lovely things in bloom. During that week of sunshine, she became more intimate with Ben Weatherstaff. She surprised him several times by seeming to start up beside him as if she sprang out of the earth. The truth was that she was afraid that he would pick up his tools and go away if he saw her coming, so she always walked toward him as silently as possible. But in fact he didn't object to her as strongly as he had at first. Perhaps he was secretly rather flattered by her evident desire for his elderly company. Then also she was more civil than she had been. He didn't know that when she first saw him she spoke to him as she would have spoken to a native, and had not known that a cross, sturdy old Yorkshireman was not accustomed to salaam to his masters, and be merely commanded by them to do things. "You're like the robin, I never knows when I see you or which side you come from," he said to her one morning when he lifted his head and saw her standing by him. "He's friends with me now." "Well, that's like him, making up to the women folk just for the vanity and the flightliness. Nothing he wouldn't do for the sake of showing off and flirting his tail feathers. He's full of pride as an egg's full of meat." He very seldom talked much, and sometimes didn't even answer Mary's questions except by a grunt, but this morning he said more than usual. He stood up and rested one hobnailed boot on the top of his spade while he looked her over. "How long you been here?" "I think it's been about a month." "That's beginning to do Misselthwaite credit. You're fatter than you were, and you're not quite so yellow. You look like a young plucked crow when you first came into the garden. Thinks I to myself, I never said I was an uglier, sour-faced young'un." Mary wasn't vain, and she'd never thought much of her looks, so she wasn't greatly disturbed. "I know I'm fatter. My stockings are getting tighter. They used to make wrinkles. There's the robin, Ben Weatherstaff." And there indeed was the robin, and she thought he looked nicer than ever. His red waistcoat was glossy as satin, and he flirted his wings and tail, and tilted his head, and hopped about with all sorts of lively graces. He seemed determined to make Ben Weatherstaff admire him, but Ben was sarcastic. "Ah, there you are. You can put up with me for a bit sometimes when you got no one better. You've been redding up your waistcoat and polishing your feathers for 2 weeks. I know what she's up to. There's some young bold madam somewhere telling you lies to her about it being the finest robin on Misselmoor, being ready to fight the rest of 'em."
"Oh, look at him."
The robin was evidently in a fascinating, bold mood. He hopped closer and closer and looked at Ben Weatherstaff more and more engagingly. He flew under the nearest currant bush and tilted his head and sang a little song right at him. "You think you get over me by doing that?" said Ben, wrinkling up his face in such a way that Mary felt sure he was trying not to look pleased. "You think no one can stand out against you, that's what you think." And the robin spread his wings. Mary could scarcely believe her eyes. He flew right up to the handle of Ben Weatherstaff's spade and alighted right on the top of it. And the man's old face wrinkled itself slowly into a new expression. He stood still as if he were afraid to breathe, as if he wouldn't have stirred for the world lest his robin should start away. and he spoke in quite a whisper. "Well, I'll be danged," he said softly, as if he were saying something quite different. "You do know how to get out of the trap, you do. That's very unearthly, this knowing." And he stood without stirring, almost without drawing his breath, until the robin gave another flirt to his wings and flew away. And then he stood looking at the handle of the spade as if there might be magic in it. Then he began to dig again and said nothing for several minutes. But because he kept breaking into a slow grin now and then, Mary wasn't afraid to talk to him. "Have you got a garden of your own?" "No, I'm a bachelor and lies with the Martin at the gate." "If you had one, what would you plant?" "Cabbages and taters and onions." "But if you wanted to make a flower garden, what would you plant?" "Bulbs and sweet-smelling things, but mostly roses." And Mary's face lit up. "Do you like roses?" Ben Weatherstaff rooted up a weed and threw it aside before he answered. "Well, yes, I do. I was learned that by a young lady I was gardener to. She had a lot in the place she was fond of. She loved 'em like they was children, or robins. I even seen her bend over and kiss 'em." He dragged out another weed and scowled at it. "That there was much as 10 years ago." "Where's she now?" "Heaven." And he drove his spade deep into the soil, according to what the parson says. "What happened to the roses?" "They got left to themselves." "Did they quite die? Do roses quite die when they're left to themselves?" "Well, I'd got to like 'em, and I'd liked her, and she liked 'em. Once or twice a year I'd go and work at 'em a bit, prune 'em and dig about the roots. They run wild, but they was in rich soil, so some of 'em lived." "When they have no leaves and look gray and brown and dry, how can you tell whether they're dead or alive?" "Wait till the spring gets at 'em. Wait till the sun shines and rain and sunshine, and then we'll find out." "How?" "Look along the twigs and branches, and if you see a bit of a brown lump swelling here and there, watch it after the warm rain. See what happens." And he stopped suddenly and looked curiously at her eager face. "Why do you care so much about roses all of a sudden?" And Mistress Mary felt her face grow red. She was almost afraid to answer. "I want to play that I have a garden of my own. There's nothing for me to do. I have nothing and no one." "Well," said Weatherstaff slowly as he watched her, "that's true. You haven't." He said it in such an odd way that Mary wondered if he was actually a little sorry for her. She'd never felt sorry for herself. She'd only felt tired and cross because she disliked people and things so much. But now the world seemed to be changing and getting nicer. If no one found out about the secret garden, she should enjoy herself anyway. She stayed with him for 10 or 15 minutes longer and asked him as many questions as she dared. He answered every one of them in his queer grunting way. He didn't seem really cross, and didn't pick up his spade and leave her. He said something about roses, just as she was going away, and it reminded her of the ones he'd said he'd been fond of. "Do you go and see those other roses now?" "Not this year. My rheumatics made me too stiff in the joints." And he said it with a grumbling voice, and then quite suddenly he seemed to get angry with her, though she wouldn't see why he should. "Now look here. Don't ask so many questions. You're the worst wench for asking questions I ever come across. Get you gone and get playing. I'm done talking for today." And he said it so crossly she knew there was not the least use in staying another minute. She went skipping slowly down the outside walk, thinking him over and over to herself. Queer as it was, here was another person who she liked in spite of his crossness. She liked old Ben Weatherstaff. Yes, she did like him. She always wanted to try and make him talk to her. And so she began to believe that he knew everything in the world about flowers. There was a laurel-hedged walk which curved round the secret garden and ended at a gate which opened into a wood in the park. She thought she would slip round this walk and look into the wood and see if there were any rabbits hopping about. She enjoyed the skipping very much, and when she reached the little gate she opened it and went through because she heard a low, peculiar whistling and wanted to find out what it was. It was a very strange thing indeed. She quite caught her breath as she stopped to look at it. A boy was sitting under a tree, with his back against it, playing on a rough wooden pipe. He was a funny-looking boy. He was about 12. He looked very clean, and his nose turned up, and his cheeks were as red as poppies, and never had Mistress Mary seen such brown and such blue eyes in any boy's face. And on the trunk of the tree he leaned against A brown squirrel was clinging and watching him, and from behind a bush nearby a pheasant was delicately stretching his neck to peep out, and quite near him were two rabbits sitting up and sniffling with tremulous noises. And actually watch it appear as if they were all drawing near to watch him and listen to the strange little low call that his pipe seemed to make. And when he saw Mary, he held up his hand and spoke to her in a voice almost as low and rather like his piping. "Don't you move. It flight 'em." Mary remained motionless, and he stopped playing his pipe and began to rise from the ground. He moved so slowly that it scarcely seemed as though he were moving at all, but at last he stood onto his feet, and the squirrel scampered back up into the branches of his tree, the pheasant withdrew his head, and the rabbits dropped on all fours and began to hop away, though not at all as if they were frightened. "I'm Dickon. I know you're Miss Mary." And then Mary realized that somehow she'd known at first that he was Dickon, who could have been charming rabbits and pheasants, as the native charms snake in India. He had a wide, red, curving mouth, and his smile spread all over his face. "I got up slow, 'cause if you make a quick move, it startles 'em. A body's got to move gentle and speak low when wild things is about." He didn't speak to her as if they'd never seen each other before, but as if he knew her quite well. Mary knew nothing about boys, and she spoke to him a little stiffly because she felt rather shy. "Did you get Martha's letter?" And he nodded his curly, rust-colored head. "That's why I'd come." And he stooped to pick up something which had been lying on the ground beside him when he piped. "I got the garden tools. There's a little spade and a rake and a fork and a hoe. Yeah, they're good ones. There's a trowel, too. Woman in the shop threw in a packet of white poppy and one of bark blue larkspur when I bought the other seeds." "Will you show the seeds to me?" She wished she could talk as he did. His speech was so quick and easy. It sounded as if he liked her and wasn't the least bit afraid she wouldn't like him, though he was only a common moor boy in patched clothes and funny face and rough, rusty red head. As she came closer to him, she noticed that there was a clean, fresh scent of heather and grass and leaves about him, almost as if he was made of them. She liked it very much, and when she looked into his funny face with the red cheeks and round blue eyes, she forgot that she'd felt shy. "Let's sit down on this log and look at them." They sat down, and he took a clumsy little brown paper package out of his coat pocket. He untied the string, and inside there were ever so many neater and smaller packages, with a picture of a flower on each one. There's a lot of mignonette and poppies. Mignonette is the sweetest smelling thing that grows, and it'll grow wherever you cast it, same as poppies will. These come up and bloom if you just whistle to 'em. They're the nicest of all." And he stopped and turned his head quickly, his poppy-cheeked face lighting up. "Where's that robin that's calling us?" And the chirp came from a thick holly bush, bright with scarlet berries, and Mary thought she knew whose it was. "Is it really calling us?" "Yeah," said Dickon, as if it was the most natural thing in the world. "He's calling someone he's friends with. It's the same as saying, 'Here I am, look at me, want a bit of a chat.' There he is in the bush. Who is he?" "He's Ben Weatherstaff's, but I think he knows me a little." "Well, he knows you," said Dickon in a low voice again. "And he likes you. He's took you on, and he'll tell me all about you in a minute." And he moved quite close to the bush, with a slow movement Mary had noticed before. Then he made a sound almost like the robin's own twitter. The robin listened a few seconds intently, then answered quite as if he were replying to a question. "Oh, yeah, he's a friend of yours." "Do you think he is? Do you think he really likes me?" "Well, he wouldn't come near you if he didn't. Birds is bird choosers. A robin can flout a body worse than a man. He's making up to you now. Can you not see the chap he's saying?" It really seemed as if it must be true. He so sidled and twittered and tilted as he hopped on his bush. "Do you understand everything birds say?" And Dickon's grin spread until he seemed all wide, red, curving mouth, and he rubbed his rough head. "I think I do, and I think they think I do. I've lived on the moor with 'em so long, I watched 'em break shell and come out and fledge and learn to fly and begin to sing, till I think I'm one of 'em. Sometimes I think perhaps I'm a bird or a fox or a rabbit or a squirrel or even a beetle, and I don't know it." And he laughed and came back to the log and began to talk about the flower seeds again. He told her what they looked like when they were flowers. He told her how to plant them and watch them and feed and water them. "See here, I'll plant 'em for you myself. Where's the garden?" and Mary's thin hands clutched each other as they lay on her lap. She didn't know what to say for a whole minute, so she said nothing. She'd never thought of it. She felt miserable, and she felt as if she went red and then pale. "Oh, you got a bit of garden, don't you?" And it was true that she had turned red and then pale. Dickon watched her do it, and still she said nothing. He began to be puzzled. "Wouldn't they give you a bit? Hasn't you got any yet?" And she held her hands tighter, and her eyes turned toward him. "I don't know anything about boys. Could you keep a secret if I told you one? It's a great secret. I don't know what I should do if one found it out. I believe I should die." She said the last sentence quite fiercely. Dickon looked more puzzled than ever, and even rubbed his hand over his rough head again, but he answered quite good-humouredly. "I'm keeping secrets all the time if I couldn't keep secrets from the other lads, secrets about foxes' cubs and birds' nests and other wild things' holes. Well, I figure there wouldn't be anything safe on the moor. Yeah, I can keep a secret." Mistress Mary didn't mean to put out her hand and clutch his sleeve, but she did it. "I've stolen a garden. It isn't mine, it isn't anybody's. Nobody wants it, nobody cares for it, nobody ever goes into it. Perhaps everything's dead in it already. I don't know." She began to feel hot, and as contrary as she'd ever felt in her life. I don't care. I don't care. I don't care. I don't care. Nobody has any right to take it from me when I care about it, and they don't. They're letting it die. I'll shut it on itself." She ended this passionately, and she threw her arms over her face and burst out crying, poor little Mistress Mary. Dickon's curious blue eyes grew rounder and rounder. He said, drawing his exclamation out slowly, and the way he did it meant both wonder and sympathy. "I've nothing to do. Nothing belongs to me. I found it myself, and I got into it myself. I was only just like the robin, and they wouldn't take it from the robin." "Where is it?" asked Dickon in a dropped voice, and Mary got up from the log at once. She knew she felt contrary again and obstinate. She didn't care at all. She was impervious and Indian at the same time, hot and sorrowful. "Come with me, and I'll show you." And she led him round the laurel path into the walk where the ivy grew so thickly. Dickon followed her with a strange, almost pitying look on his face. He felt as if he were being led to look at some strange bird's nest and must move softly. When she stepped onto the wall and moved the hanging ivy, he started. There was a door, and Mary pushed it open slowly. They passed in together, then Mary stood and waved her hand round defiantly. "It's this. It's a secret garden. I'm the only one in the world who wants it to be alive." And Dickon looked round and round about it, and round again. "Oh, it's a queer, pretty place. It's like if a body was in a dream." Chapter 11. The Nest of the Missel Thrush. For 2 or 3 minutes he stood looking around him, while Mary watched him, and then he began to walk about softly, even more lightly than Mary had walked the first time she had found herself inside the 4 walls. His eyes seemed to be taking in everything. The grey trees with the grey creepers climbing over them and hanging from their branches, the tangle on the walls and among the grass, the evergreen alcoves with the stone seats and tall flower urns standing in them. "Never thought I'd see this place." "Do you know about it?" She'd spoken aloud, and he made a sign to her. "We must talk low, or someone will hear us and wonder what's to do in here." "Oh, I forgot," Mary said, feeling frightened and putting her hand quickly against her mouth. "Did you know about the garden?" she asked again when she had recovered herself. And Dickon nodded. "Martha told us there was one no one ever went inside. Us used to wonder what it was like." And he stopped and looked round at the lovely grey tangle about him, and his round eyes looked strangely happy. "Oh, the nests will be here come springtime. It'll be the safest nesting place in England. No one ever coming near the tangles of trees and roses to build in. I wonder all the birds out on the moor don't build here." And Mary put her hand on his arm again without knowing it. "Will there be roses? Can you tell? I thought they were all dead." No, not all of them. Not all of them. Look here." And he stepped over to the nearest tree, an old one with grey lichen all over its bark, but upholding a curtain of tangled sprays and branches. He took a thick knife out of his pocket and opened one of the branches. "There's lots of dead wood that ought to be cut out. There's a lot of old wood, but it made some new last year. This here's a new bit. He touched a shoot which looked brownish green instead of hard, dry gray. Mary touched it herself in an eager, reverent way.
That one? Is that one quite alive?
It's as Wick or you and me. And Mary remembered that Martha had told her that Wick meant alive or lively.
I'm glad it's Wick. I want them all to be Wick. Let us go around the garden and count how many Wick ones there are.
She panted with eagerness, and Dickon was as eager as she was. They went from tree to tree and from bush to bush. Dickon carried his knife in his hand and showed her things which she thought wonderful.
Well, they've run wild, but the strongest ones have
fair thrived on it. The delicatest ones have died out, but the others have grown and grown, spread and spread until there's a wonder. See here. And he pulled down a thick, gray, dry-looking branch.
A body might think this was dead wood, but I don't believe it is down to the root. I'll cut it low down and see.
He knelt and with his knife cut the lifeless-looking branch through, not far above the earth.
There, I told you so. There's green in that wood yet. Look at it.
Mary was down on her knees before he spoke, gazing with all her might.
When it looks a bit greenish and juicy like that, it's Wick. When the inside's dry and breaks easy like here, this piece I've cut off, it's done for. There's a big root here. There's all this live wood sprung out of. If the old wood's cut off and it's dug round, took care of, there'll be...
He stopped and looked above his face to look at the climbing and hanging sprays.
There'll be a fountain of roses here this summer.
And they went from bush to bush and from tree to tree. He was very strong and clever with his knife, and knew how to cut the dry and dead wood away, and could tell when an unpromising bough or twig had still had some green life in it. In the course of half an hour, Mary thought she could tell too. When he cut through a lifeless-looking branch, she would cry out joyfully under her breath when she caught sight of the least shade of moist green. The spade and hoe and fork were very useful. He showed her how to use the fork while he dug about roots with the spade and stirred the earth and let the air in. They were working industriously round one of the biggest standard roses when he caught sight of something which made him utter an exclamation of surprise.
"Why, who did that here?"
he cried, pointing to the grass a few feet away. It was one of Mary's own little clearings around the pale green points.
"I did it."
"Why, I thought you didn't know anything about gardening."
"I don't, but they were so little. The grass was so thick and strong they looked as if they had no room to breathe, so I made a place for them. I don't even know what they are."
And Dickon went and knelt down by them, smiling his wide smile.
"You were right. A gardener couldn't have told you better. They'll grow now like Jack's beanstalk. They're crocuses and snowdrops, and these here's narcissuses,"
and he turned to another patch.
"And here's daffodowndillys. Oh, there'll be a sight."
And he ran from one clearing to another.
"You've done a lot of work for such a little wench." I'm growing fatter, and I'm growing stronger. I used to be always tired. When I dig, I'm not tired at all. I like to smell the earth when it's turned up." "It's rare good for thee. There's naught as nice as the smell of good, fresh, clean earth, except the smell of fresh growing things when the rain falls on 'em. I get on the moors many days when it's raining. I lie under a bush and listen to the soft swish of drops on the heather, and I just sniff and sniff. My nose then fair quivers like a rabbit, mother says." "Do you never catch cold?" inquired Mary, gazing at him wonderingly. She'd never seen such a funny boy, or neither a nice one. "Not me. I've never catched cold since I was born. Wasn't brought up nesh enough. Chased about the moor in all weathers, same as the rabbits does. Mother says I've sniffed up too much fresh air for 12 years to ever get to sniffing with cold. Tough as a white thorn hunting knobstick." And he was working all the time he was talking. And Mary was following him and helping him with her fork or the trowel. "There's a lot of work to do here," he said at once, looking about quite exultantly. "Will you come again and help me do it? I'm sure I can help, too. I can dig and pull up weeds and do whatever you tell me. Oh, do come, Dickon." I'll come every day, if that's what you want me. Rain or shine, it's the best fun I've ever had in my life, shutting here, waking it up a garden. If you'll help me to make it alive, I don't know what I'll do," she ended helplessly. "What could you do for a boy like that?" "I'll tell you what that'll do. You'll get fat and hungry as a young fox, and then you'll learn how to talk to the robins same as I do. Oh, we'll have plenty of fun."
and he began to walk about, looking up at the trees and at the walls and bushes with a thoughtful expression. Wouldn't want to make it look like a gardener's garden, all clipped and spick and span, would you? It's nicer like this with the things running wild and swinging and catching hold of each other.
Don't let us make it tidy. It wouldn't seem like a secret garden if it was tidy.
And Dickon stood rubbing his rusty red head with a rather puzzled look. It's a secret garden, sure enough, but it seems like someone besides a robin must have been in it, since it was shut up 10 years ago.
But the door was locked and the key was buried. Nobody can get in.
That's true. It's a strange place. Seems to me as if there'd been a bit of pruning done here and there later than 10 years ago.
But how could it have been done?
And he was examining a branch of standard rose, and he shook his head. How could it? With the door locked and the key buried? Mistress Mary always felt that however many years she lived, she would never forget that first morning. Ooh boy. That first morning when her garden began to grow. Of course, it did seem to begin to grow for her that morning. When Dickon began to clear places to plant seeds, she remembered what Basil had sung at her when he wanted to tease her.
Are there any flowers that look like bells?
Lilies of the valley. Oh, lilies of the valley does, he answered, digging away with the trowel. There's Canterbury bells and campanulas.
Let's plant some. There's lilies of the valley here already. I saw them. They'll have grown too close and we'll have to separate them.
But there's... no, that second line was actually Dickon. Cool. There's lilies of the valley here already. I saw them. They'll have grown too close. We'll have to separate them, but there's plenty. The other ones take 2 years to bloom from seed, but I can bring you some bits of plants for my cottage garden. Why do you want them? And then Mary told him about Basil and his brothers and sisters in India, and how she had hated them, and they're calling her Mistress Mary, quite contrary.
They used to dance round and sing at me. They sang, Mistress Mary, quite contrary, how does your garden grow? With silver bells and cockle shells and marigolds all in a row. I just remembered it, and it made me wonder if there really were flowers like silver bells.
And she frowned a little and gave her trowel a rather spiteful dig into the earth.
I wasn't as contrary as they were.
But Dickon laughed. He said, and as he crumbled the rich black soil, she saw that he was sniffing up the scent of it. Doesn't seem to be any need for one to be contrary when there's flowers and such like, and lots of friendly wild things running about making homes for themselves, or building nets and singing and whistling, does there? And Mary, kneeling by him holding the seeds, looked at him, and she stopped frowning.
Dickon, you're as nice as Martha said you were. I like you, and you make the 5th person. Never should thought if I would like 5 people.
And Dickon sat upon his heels as Martha did when she was polishing the grate. He did look funny and delightful, Mary thought, with his round blue eyes and his red cheeks and happy-looking turned-up nose.
Only 5 folks you likes. Who's the other 4? Your mother and Martha and the robin and Ben Weatherstaff.
And Dickon laughed so that he was obliged to stifle the sound by putting his arm over his mouth. I know you thinks I'm a queer lad, but I think you're the queerest little lass I ever saw. Then Mary did a strange thing. She leaned forward and asked him a question she'd never dreamed of asking anyone before. And she tried to ask it in Yorkshire, 'cause that was his language, and in India a native was always pleased if you knew his speech.
Does you like me?
Oh, that I does. I likes you wonderful, and so does Sir Robin, I do believe.
That's 2 then. That's 2 for me.
They began to work harder than ever and more joyfully. Mary was startled and sorry when she heard the big clock in the courtyard strike the hour of her midday dinner.
I should have to go, and you'll have to go soon too, won't you?
My dinner's always easy to carry about with me. Mother always let me put a bit of something in my pocket. And he picked up his coat from the grass and brought out a pocket of his pocket, a lumpy little bundle tied up in a quite clean, coarse, blue and white handkerchief. It held 2 thick pieces of bread with a slice of something laid between them. It's often as not but bread, but I've got a fine slice of fat bacon with it today. Mary thought it looked a strange dinner, but he seemed ready to enjoy it. Run on and get your victuals. I'll be done with mine first. I'll get some more work done before I start back home. and he sat down with his back against a tree. "I'll call the robin up and give him the rind of the bacon to peck at. He likes a bit of fat wonderful." Mary could scarcely bear to leave him. Suddenly it seemed as if he might be a sort of wood fairy, who might be gone when she came into the garden again. He seemed too good to be true. She went slowly halfway to the door in the wall, then she stopped and went back.
"Whatever happens, you would never tell?"
And his poppy-colored cheeks were distended with his first big bite of bread and bacon, but he managed to smile encouragingly. "If you was a missel thrush and showed me where the nest was, did you think I'd tell anybody? Not me. You're as safe as a missel thrush." And she was quite sure that she was. Chapter 12. Might I have a bit of earth? Mary ran so fast that she was rather out of breath when she reached her room. Her hair was ruffled on her forehead, and her cheeks were bright pink. Her dinner was waiting on the table, and Martha was waiting near it. "You're a bit late. Where you been?"
I've seen Dickon.
"I knew he'd come. How you like him?"
I think he's beautiful,"
said Mary in a determined voice, and Martha looked rather taken aback, but she looked pleased with herself, too. "Well, he's the best lad that ever was born, but us never thought he was handsome. His nose turns up too much."
"I like it to turn up."
"And his eyes is so round, though they're a nice colour."
"I like 'em round. They're exactly the colour of the sky over the moor."
And Martha beamed with satisfaction. "Mother says he made him that colour with always looking up at the birds and the clouds. But he's got a big mouth, doesn't he now?"
"I love his big mouth. I wish mine were just like it."
"He'd look rare and funny in that bit of kind of face, but I knowed it'd be that way when you saw him. How'd you like the seeds and the garden tools?"
"How did you know he brought them?"
"Well, I never thought of him not bringing them. Be sure to bring them if they was in Yorkshire. He's such a trusty lad." Mary was afraid she might begin to ask difficult questions, but she didn't do that. She was very much interested in the seeds and the gardening tools. There was only one moment where Mary was frightened. This was where she began to ask where the flowers were planted. Who did they ask about it?"
"I haven't asked anybody yet. Well, I wouldn't ask the head gardener. He's too grand, Mr. Roach is."
"Well, I've never seen him. I've only seen under gardeners and weatherstaff."
"If I was you—"
"Oh, I wouldn't ask the head gardener. He's too grand, Mr. Roach is."
"I've never seen him. I've only seen under gardeners and weatherstaff."
"If I was you, I'd ask Ben Weatherstaff. He's not half as bad as he looks, for all he's so crabbed. Craven lets him do what he likes, 'cause he was here when Miss Craven was alive, and he used to make her laugh. She liked him. Perhaps he'll find you a corner somewhere out of the way."
"If I was out of the way and no one wanted it, no one would mind they having it, could they?"
"Well, there wouldn't be no reason. You wouldn't do no harm." And Mary ate her dinner as quickly as she could. When she rose from the table, she was going to run to her room to put on her hat again, but Martha stopped her. "I got something to tell you. Thought I'd let you eat your dinner first. Mr. Craven came back this morning, and I think he wants to see you." And Mary turned quite pale.
"Oh, why? Why? He didn't want to see me when I came. I heard Pitcher say he didn't."
"Well, Miss Medlock says it's 'cause of Mother. She was walking in Thwaite village, and she met him. She never spoke to him before, but Miss Craven's been to her cottage 2 or 3 times. He'd forgot, but Mother hadn't, and she made bold to stop him. I don't know what she said to him about you, but she said something to put him in the mind to see you before he goes away again tomorrow."
"Oh, is he going away again tomorrow? I'm glad."
"He's gone for a long time. Might not come back till autumn or winter. He's going to travel in foreign places. He's always doing it."
"Oh, I'm so glad."
If he didn't come back until winter, or even autumn, there'd be time to watch the secret garden come to life. Even if you found out then and took it away from her, she would have had that much at least.
"When do you think you'll want to see—"
And she didn't finish the sentence because the door opened and Miss Medlock walked in. She had on her best black dress and cap, and her collar was fastened with a large brooch with a picture of a man's face in it. It was a colored photograph of Mr. Medlock, who had died years ago. She always wore it when she dressed up. She looked nervous and excited.
"Your hair's rough. Go and brush it. Martha, help her to slip on her best dress. Mr. Craven sent me to bring her to him in his study."
All the pink left Mary's cheeks. Her heart began to thump, and she felt herself changing into a stiff, plain, silent child again. She didn't even answer Miss Medlock, but turned and walked into her bedroom, followed by Martha. She said nothing while her dress was changed, and her hair brushed, and after she was quite tidy, she followed Miss Medlock down the corridors, in silence. What was there for her to say? She was obliged to go and see Mr. Craven, and he knew he wouldn't like her, and she wouldn't like him. She knew what he would think of her. She was taken to a part of the house she'd not been into before, and at last Mrs. Medlock knocked at a door, and when someone said, "Come in," they entered the room together. A man was sitting in an armchair before the fire, and Miss Medlock spoke to him. "This is Miss Mary, sir."
You can go and leave her here. I'll ring for you when you want. I want you to take her away.
And when she went out and closed the door, Mary could only stand waiting, a plain little thing, twisting her thin hands together. She could see that the man in the chair was not so much a hunchback as a man with high, rather crooked shoulders, and he had black hair streaked with white. He turned his head over his high shoulders and spoke to her.
Come here.
And Mary went to him. He wasn't ugly. His face would have been handsome if he hadn't been so miserable. He looked as if the sight of her worried and fretted him, and as if he didn't know what in the world to do with her.
Are you well?
"Yes,
Do they take good care of you?
yes." And he rubbed his forehead fretfully as he looked her over.
You're very thin.
"I'm getting fatter," Mary answered in what she knew was her stiffest way. What an unhappy face he had! His black eyes seemed as if they scarcely saw her, as if they were seeing something else, and how he could hardly keep his thoughts upon her.
I forgot you. How could I remember you? I intended to send you a governess, a nurse, or some of that sort, but I forgot.
"Please, please." And then a lump in her throat choked her.
What do you want to say?
I am too big for a nurse, and please don't make me have a governess yet." He rubbed his forehead again and stared at her.
That was what the Sowerby woman said.
And he mumbled this almost absent-mindedly, while Mary gathered a scrap of courage. "Is she Martha's mother?"
Yes, I think so.
"She knows about children. She has 12. She knows." And he seemed to rouse himself.
What do you want to do?
"I want to play out of doors," Mary answered, hoping that her voice didn't tremble. "I never liked it in India. It makes me hungry here, and I'm getting fatter." He was watching her.
Miss Sowerby said it would do you good. Perhaps it will. She thought you'd better get stronger before you had a governess.
"Makes me feel strong when I play and the wind comes over the moor."
And where do you play?
"Everywhere. Martha's mother sent me a skipping rope. I skip and run, and I look about to see if things are happening. Things are beginning to stick up out of the earth. I don't do any harm."
Don't look so frightened. You couldn't do any harm, a child like you. You may do what you like.
Mary put her hand up to her throat because she was afraid he might see the excited lump which she felt jump into it. And she came a step nearer to him. "May I?" And her anxious little face seemed to worry him more than ever.
Don't look so frightened. Of course you may. I'm your guardian, though I'm a poor one for any child. I cannot give you time or attention. I'm too ill and wretched and distracted, mostly. But I wish you to be happy and comfortable. I don't know anything about children, but Miss Medlock is to see that you have all you need. I sent for you today because Miss Sowerby said I ought to see you. Her daughter had talked about you. She thought you needed fresh air and freedom and running about.
"She knows all about children."
She ought to. I thought her rather bold to stop me on the moor, but she said, Miss Craven has been kind to her.
It seemed hard for him to speak his dead wife's name.
She's a respectable woman. Now that I've seen you, I think she said sensible things. Play out of doors as much as you like. It's a big place. You can go where you like and amuse yourself as you like. Is there anything you want?" As if a sudden thought had struck him. "Do you want toys, books, dolls?"
Might I have a bit of earth?"
In her eagerness, she didn't realize how strange the words would sound, that they were not quite the ones she had meant to say, and Craven looked quite startled.
"Earth? What do you mean?"
"To plant seeds in, make things grow, see them come alive."
And he gazed at her a moment and then passed his hand quickly over his eyes.
"Do you care about gardens so much?"
"I didn't know about them in India. I was always ill and tired, and it was too hot. Sometimes I made little beds in the sand and stuck flowers in them, but it's different here."
And Craven got up and began to walk slowly across the room.
"A bit of earth,"
he said to himself, and Mary thought that somehow she must have reminded him of something. When he stopped and spoke to her, his eyes looked almost soft and kind.
"You can have as much earth as you want. You remind me of someone else who loved the earth and things that grow. When you see a bit of earth you want, take it, child, and make it come alive."
And he said this last part with a little bit of a smile.
"May I take it from anywhere if it's not wanted?"
"Anywhere. There. You must go now. I'm tired."
And he touched the bell to call Miss Medlock.
"Goodbye. I shall be away the whole summer."
Miss Medlock came so quickly that Mary thought she must have been waiting in the corridor.
"Miss Medlock, now that I've seen the child, I understand what Miss Sowerby meant. She must be less delicate before she begins lessons. Give her simple, healthy food. Let her run wild in the garden. Don't look after her too much. She needs liberty, fresh air, romping about. Standard children things. Miss Sowerby's to come and see her now and then. She may sometimes go to the cottage."
And Miss Medlock looked pleased. She was relieved to hear that she need not look after Mary too much. She had felt her as a tiresome charge, and had indeed seen as little of her as she dared. In addition to this, she was fond of Martha's mother.
"Thank you, sir. Susan Sowerby and me went to school together. She's as sensible and good-hearted a woman as you may find in today's walk. I never had any children myself, and she's had 12. There was never any healthier or better ones. Miss Mary can get no harm from them. I'd always take Susan Sowerby's advice about children myself. She's what you might call healthily minded, if you understand me."
"I understand. Take Miss Mary away now. Send Pitcher to me."
And when Miss Medlock left her at the end of her own corridor, Mary flew back to her room. She found Martha waiting there, and Martha had in fact hurried back after she had removed the dinner service.
"I can have my garden. I may have it where I like. I'm not going to have a governess for a long time. Your mother's coming to see me and going to your cottage. She says a little girl like me could not do any harm, and I may do what I like anywhere."
"Oh, well, that was nice of him, wasn't it?"
"Martha, he really is a nice man, only his face is so miserable and his forehead's all drawn together."
And she ran as quickly as she could to the garden. She had been away so much longer than she thought she would, and she knew Dickon would have to set out early on his 5-mile walk. When she slipped through the door under the ivy, she saw that he wasn't working where she'd left him. The gardening tools were all laid together under a tree. She ran to them, looking all round the place, but there was no Dickon to be seen. He had gone away, and the secret garden was empty, except for the robin who had just flown across the wall and sat on the standard rose bush, watching her.
"He's gone," she said woefully. "Oh, was he only a wood fairy?"
Something white fastened to the standard rose bush caught her eye. It was a piece of paper, in fact, and it was a piece of the letter she'd printed for Martha to send for Dickon. It was fastened to the bush with a long thorn, and in a minute she knew Dickon had left it there. There were some roughly printed letters on it and a sort of picture. First she couldn't tell what it was. Then she saw it was meant for a nest with a bird sitting on it. Underneath were the printed letters, and they said, "I will come back." Chapter 13. I Am Calling. Mary took the picture back to the house when she went to her supper, and she showed it to Martha. "I never knew our Dickon was clever as that. There's a picture of little Mr. Thrush on her nest, large as life and twice as natural." Then Mary knew Dickon had meant the picture to be a message. He meant that she might be sure he would keep her secret. Her garden was her nest, and she was like a mistle thrush. Oh, how she did like that queer common boy. She hoped he would come back the very next day, and she fell asleep looking forward to the morning. But you never know what the weather will do in Yorkshire, particularly in the springtime. She was awakened in the night by the sound of rain beating with heavy drops against her window. It was pouring down in torrents, and the wind was wuthering round the corners and the chimneys of the huge old house. Mary sat up in bed and felt miserable and angry. "The rain's as contrary as ever I was. It came because it knew I didn't want it." And she threw herself back on her pillow and buried her face. She didn't cry, but she lay and hated the sound of the heavily beating rain. She hated the wind and its wuthering. She couldn't go back to sleep again. The mournful sound kept her awake, because she felt mournful herself. If she had felt happy, it would have probably lulled her to sleep. How it wuthered, and how the big raindrops poured down and beat against the pane. "It just sounds like a person lost in the moor and wandering on and crying." She had been lying awake, turning from side to side for about an hour, when suddenly something made her sit up in bed and turn her head toward the door, listening. So she listened and listened. "It isn't the wind now. That wasn't the wind. It's different. It's that crying that I heard before." The door of her room was ajar, and the sound came from down the corridor, a far-off faint sound of fretful crying. She listened for a few more minutes, and each minute she became more and more sure. She felt as if she must find out what it was. It seemed even stranger than the secret garden and the buried key. Perhaps the fact that she was in a rebellious mood made her bold. She put her foot out of bed and stood on the floor. "I'm going to find out what it is. Everybody's in bed, and I don't care about Miss Medlock. I don't care." There was a candle by her bedside, and she took it up and went softly out of the room. The corridor looked very long and dark, but she was too excited to mind that. She thought she would remember the corners she must turn to find the short corridor with a door covered with a tapestry. The one Miss Medlock had come through the day she lost herself. The sound had come up that passage, and so she went on with her dim light, almost feeling her way, her heart beating so loud that she fancied she could hear it. The far-off faint crying went on and led her. Sometimes it stopped for a moment and then began again. Was this the right corner to turn? She stopped and thought. Yes, it was. Down this passage, and then to the left, and then up 2 broad steps, and then to the right again. Yes, there was the tapestry door. She pushed it open very gently, and closed it behind her, and she stood in the corridor and could hear the crying quite plainly, though it wasn't loud. It was on the other side of the wall at her left, and a few yards farther on there was a door. She could see a glimmer of light coming from beneath it. The someone was crying in that room, and it was quite a young someone. So she walked to the door and pushed it open. There she was, standing in the room. It was a big room with ancient, handsome furniture in it. There was a low fire glowing faintly on the hearth, and a night-light burning by the side of the carved 4-posted bed hung with brocade, and on the bed was lying a boy crying fretfully. Mary wondered if she was in a real place, or if she had fallen asleep again and was dreaming without knowing it. The boy had a sharp, delicate face, the color of ivory, and he seemed to have eyes too big for it. He had also a lock of hair which tumbled over his forehead in heavy locks, and made his thin face seem smaller. He looked like a boy who had been ill, but he was crying more as if he were tired and cross than if he were in pain. Mary stood near the door with her candle in her hand, holding her breath. Then she crept across the room, and as she drew near, the light attracted the boy's attention, and he turned his head on the pillow and stared at her, his gray eyes opening so wide they seemed immense. "Who are you? Are you a ghost?" "No, I'm not. Are you one?
And he stared and stared and stared. Mary couldn't help noticing what strange eyes he had. They were agate gray, and they looked too big for his face because they had black lashes all round them.
No, I am Colin. Who's Colin? I'm Colin Craven. Who are you? I'm Mary Lennox. Mr. Craven's my uncle. He's my father. Your father? No one ever told me I had a boy. Why didn't they? Come here.
And he said this, still keeping his strange eyes fixated on her with an anxious expression. She came close to the bed, and he put out his hand and touched her.
You are real, aren't you? I have such real dreams very often. You might be one of them.
Mary had slipped on a woolen wrapper before she left her room. She put a piece of it between his fingers.
Rub that and see how thick and warm it is. I'll pinch you a little if you like to show you how real I am. For a minute I thought you might be a dream too. Where did you come from? From my own room. The wind weathered so I couldn't go to sleep, and I heard someone crying and I wanted to find out who it was. What were you crying for? Because I couldn't go to sleep either and my head ached. Tell me your name again. Mary Lennox. Did no one ever tell you I'd come to live here?
He was still fingering the fold of her wrapper, but he began to look a little more as if he believed in her reality.
No, they daren't. Why? Because I should have been afraid you would see me. I won't let people see me and talk me over. Why?
Mary asked again, feeling more mystified with every passing moment.
Because I'm like this always, ill and having to lie down. My father won't let people talk me over either. Servants aren't allowed to speak about me. If I live, I may be a hunchback, but I shan't live. My father hates to think I may be like him. Oh, what a strange house is this. What a queer house. Everything's kind of secret. Rooms are locked up, gardens are locked up. And have you been locked up? No, I stay in this room because I don't want to be moved out of it. It tires me too much. Does your father come and see you? Sometimes, generally when I'm asleep. He doesn't want to see me. Why?
And a sort of angry shadow passed over the boy's face.
My mother died when I was born, and it makes him wretched to look at me. He thinks I don't know, but I've heard people talking. He almost hates me. He hates the garden because she died,
Mary said, half speaking to herself.
What garden? Oh, just a garden she used to like. Have you been here always? Nearly always. Sometimes I've been taken to places at the seaside, but I won't stay because people stare at me. I used to wear an iron thing to keep my back straight, but a grand doctor came from London to see me and said it was stupid. Said to take it off and keep me out in the fresh air. I hate fresh air and I don't want to go out. I didn't when I first came here. Why do you keep looking at me like that? Because of the dreams that are so real. Sometimes when I open my eyes, I don't believe I'm awake. We're both awake.
And she glanced around the room with its high ceiling and shadowy corners in the dim firelight.
It looks quite like a dream, and it's the middle of the night. And everyone in the house is asleep, everybody but us. We're wide awake. I don't want it to be a dream.
Mary thought of something all at once.
If you don't like people to see you, do you want me to go away?
And he still held the fold of her wrapper, and he gave it a little pull.
No, I should be sure if you were a dream if you went. If you were real, sit down on that big footstool and talk. I want to hear about you.
So Mary put down her candle on the table near the bed and sat down on the cushioned stool. She didn't want to go away at all. She wanted to stay in the mysterious hidden-away room and talk to the mysterious boy.
What do you want me to tell you?
He wanted to know how long she'd been at Misselthwaite. He wanted to know which corridor her room was on. He wanted to know what she'd been doing, if she disliked the moor as he disliked it, and where she lived before she came to Yorkshire. She answered all these questions and many more, and he lay back on his pillow and listened. He made her tell him a great deal about India and her voyage across the ocean. She found out that because he had been an invalid, he had not learned things as other children had. One of his nurses had taught him to read when he was quite little, and he was always reading and looking at pictures and splendid books. Though his father rarely saw him when he was awake, he was given all sorts of wonderful things to amuse himself with. He never seemed to have been amused, however. He could never have anything he asked. He could have anything he asked for, was never made to do anything he didn't like to. Everyone's obliged to do what pleases me. Makes me ill to be angry. No one believes I shall live to grow up. And he said it
as if he was so accustomed to the idea that it ceased to matter to him at all. He seemed to like the sound of Mary's voice. As she went on talking, he listened in a drowsy, interested way. Once or twice she wondered if he were not gradually falling into a doze, but at last he asked a question which opened up a new subject.
"How old are you?"
"I'm 10, and so are you."
"How do you know that?"
"Because when you were born the garden door was locked and the key was buried, and it's been locked for 10 years.
Colin sat up, turning toward her, leaning on his elbows.
"What garden door was locked? Where was the key buried?"
He exclaimed as if he was suddenly very much interested.
It was the garden Mr. Craven hates. He locked the door. No one knew where he buried the key."
"What sort of garden is it?"
"No one's been allowed to go into it for 10 years.
But it was too late to be careful. He was too much like herself. He too had nothing to think about, and the idea of a hidden garden attracted him as it attracted her. He asked question after question. Where was it? Had she never looked for the door? Had she never asked the gardeners?
"They won't talk about it. I think they've been told not to answer questions."
"I'd make them."
"Could you?"
Mary faltered, beginning to feel frightened. If he could make people answer questions, who knew what might happen?
"Everyone's obliged to please me. I told you that. If I were to live, this place would sometime belong to me. They all know that. I'd make them tell me."
Mary had not known that she herself had been spoiled, but she could see quite plainly that this mysterious boy had been. He thought that the whole world belonged to him. How peculiar he was, and how coolly he spoke of not living.
"Do you think he won't live?"
she asked, partly because she was curious, and partly in hope of making him forget the garden.
"I don't suppose I shall,"
he answered as indifferently as he'd spoken before.
Ever since I remember anything, I've heard people say I shan't. At first they thought I was too little to understand, and now they think I don't hear. But I do. My doctor is my father's cousin. He's quite poor, and if I die, he will have all Misselthwaite when my father's dead. But I should think he wouldn't want me to live."
"Do you want to live?"
"No, but I don't want to die. When I feel ill, I lie here and think about it, and I cry and I cry."
"I've heard you crying 3 times, but I didn't know who it was. Were you crying about that?"
But she didn't want him to forget she did so to help him forget the garden.
"I dare say. Let us talk about something else. Talk about that garden. Don't you want to see it?"
"Yes."
"I do, but I don't think I've ever really wanted to see something before. But I want to see that garden. I want the key dug up. I want the door unlocked. I want to take them there in my chair. And they'd be getting fresh air. I'm going to make them open the door."
He'd become quite excited, and his strange eyes began to shine like stars, and more immense than ever.
"They have to please me. I'll make them take me there, and I'll let you go too."
Mary's hands clutched at each other. Everything would be spoiled, everything. Dickon would never come back. She'd never again feel like a missel thrush with a safe hidden nest.
"Oh, don't do that."
And he stared as if he thought she'd gone crazy.
"Why? You wanted me to see it. You said you wanted to see it."
"I do, but if you make them open the door and take you in like that, it'll never be a secret again."
He leaned still farther forward.
"A secret? What do you mean? Tell me."
And Mary's words almost tumbled over one another.
"You see, if no one knows but ourselves, if there was a door hidden somewhere under the ivy, if there was, and we could find it, and if we could slip through it together and shut it behind us, and no one knew that anyone was inside, and we called it our garden and pretended that we were missel thrushes and it was our nest, and if we played there almost every day and dug and planted seeds and made it all come alive—"
"Is it dead?"
"It'll soon be, but if no one cares for it, the bulbs will live, but the roses—"
"What are bulbs?"
he put in quickly, stopping her.
"They're daffodils and lily and snowdrops. They're working in the earth now, pushing up pale green points because the spring is coming."
"Is spring coming? What's it like? You don't see it in rooms if you're ill."
"It's the sun shining on the rain and the rain falling and the sunshine and things pushing up and working under the earth. If the garden was a secret and we could get into it, we could watch the things grow bigger every day and see how many roses are alive. Don't you see? Oh, don't you see how much nicer it'd be if it was a secret?"
And he dropped back on his pillow and lay there with an odd expression on his face.
"I never had a secret, except the one about not living to grow up. They don't know that I know about that, so it sort of is a secret, but I like this kind better."
If you won't make them take you to the garden, perhaps I feel almost sure I can find out how to get in sometime. Then if the doctor wants you to go out in your chair, and if you can always do what you want to, perhaps we might find some boy who would push you.
We'd go alone, and it'd be always such a secret garden. I should like that," he said slowly, his eyes growing dreamy. "I should like that. I shouldn't mind fresh air in a secret garden." Mary began to recover her breath and feel safer, because the idea of keeping the secret seemed to please him. She almost felt sure that if she kept on talking and could make him see the garden as mine as she'd seen it, that he would like it so much she could not bear to think that anybody might tramp in it when they chose. "I'll tell you what it would be like if we could grow into it. It's been shut up so long things have grown into a tangle, perhaps." And he lay quite still and listened while she went on talking about the roses which might have clambered from tree to tree and hung down, about the many birds which might have built their nests there because it was so safe. Then she told him about the robin and Ben Weatherstaff. There was so much to tell about the robin. It was so easy and safe to talk about it that she ceased to be afraid. The robin pleased him so much that he smiled until he looked almost beautiful, and at first Mary had thought that he was even plainer than herself, with his big eyes and heavy locks of hair. "I didn't know birds could be like that. But if you stay in your room you never see things. What a lot of things you know. I feel as if you'd been inside that garden." She didn't know what to say, as she didn't say anything. He evidently didn't expect an answer, and the next moment he gave her a surprise. I'm gonna let you look at something. You see that rose-colored silk curtain hanging on the wall over the mantelpiece?" Mary had not noticed it before, but she looked up and saw it. It was a curtain of soft silk hanging over what seemed to be some picture. "Yes, there's a cord hanging in it. Go and pull it." And Mary got up, much mystified, and found the cord. When she pulled it, the silk curtain ran back on rings, and when it ran back, it uncovered a picture. It was a picture of a girl with a laughing face. She had bright hair tied up with a blue ribbon, and her gay, lovely eyes were exactly like Colin's unhappy ones, agate gray and looking twice as big as they really were, because of the black lashes all round them. "She's my mother. I don't see why she died. Sometimes I hate her for doing so." "How strange. If she'd lived, I believe I shouldn't have been here ill always. Dare say I would have lived, too, and my father wouldn't have hated to look at me. I dare say I should have had a strong back. Draw the curtain again, please." And Mary did as she was told, and returned to her footstool. "She's much prettier than you, but her eyes are just like yours. At least they are the same shape and color. Why's the curtain drawn over her?" "I made them do it. Sometimes I don't like to see her looking at me. She smiles too much when I'm ill and miserable. Besides, she's mine, and I don't want everyone to see her." There were moments of silence, and then Mary spoke. What would Miss Medlock do if she found out I'd been here?" "She'd do as I told her to do. I should tell her that I wanted you to come here and talk to me every day. I'm glad you came." "So am I. I'll come as often as I can, but I shall have to look every day for the garden door." "Yes, you must. You can tell me about it afterward." He lay thinking a few minutes, as he'd done before, and then he spoke again. "I think you shall be a secret, too. I won't tell him until I find out. I can always send the nurses out of the room and say that I want to be by myself. Do you know Martha?" "Yes, I know her very well. She waits on me." And he nodded his head toward the outer corridor. "She's the one who is asleep in the other room. The other nurse went away yesterday to spend all night with her sister, and she always makes Martha attend to me when she wants to go out. Martha shall tell you when you come here." Then Mary understood Martha's troubled look when she asked questions about the crying. "Martha knew about you the whole time?" "Yes, she often attends to me. The nurse likes to get away from me, and then Martha comes." "I've been here a long time. Shall I go away now? Your eyes look sleepy." "I wish I could go to sleep before you leave me," he said rather shyly. "Shut your eyes," said Mary, drawing her footstool closer, "and I'll do what my ayah used to do in India. I'll pat your hand and stroke it and sing something quite low." "I should like that, perhaps." And somehow she was sorry for him and didn't want him to lie awake, so she leaned against the bed and began to stroke and pat his hand and sing a very low little chanting song in Hindustani. "That is nice," he said, more drowsily. Then she went chanting and stroking, but when she looked up at him again, his black lashes were lying close against his cheeks, for his eyes were shut and he was fast asleep. So she got up softly, took her candle, and crept away without making a sound.
Alright, folks, so we're coming up on chapter 14, and there are 27 of these. So, we've just finished chapter 13, minus 27 leaves 14. So we have 14 chapters, and we're coming up on chapter 14 currently. So, we'll come back next week to see just how much farther into the secret garden we get. And when we do come back, we'll get into chapter 14, a young Raha. Anyway, folks, this has been Paper Cuts, and I hope it didn't sting.